I don't want no oil, a spoil in my shoreline. I like fish much better than crud. I like birds and things a-creeping and crawling. Won't trade no more oil for blood. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that black demon oil's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. I don't want them nukes run by them kooks who think radioactivity is fun. No more three-headed frogs or kids with leukemia. Nuclear power ain't fit for a dog. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that nuclear power's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. No nukes! Good morning, Toledo, and good afternoon, Columbus, and hello to those of you listening on the internet, wherever and whenever you are. My name is Joe DeMare, and I'm here with my fabulous co-host,
Rebecca Wood.
Yes, together Rebecca and I are going to craft a beautiful hour of radio called For a Green Future. For a Green Future is a show where we talk about ecology and the environment, and we talk about it in the ways that it affects you, your wealth, your health, your happiness. And I'm once again broadcasting not from the studio, but out out and about. I happen to be at the beautiful Humphrey Nature Center, the solar-powered Humphrey Nature Center in Letchworth State Park in New York. And there's a whole bunch of reasons I found myself out here this weekend. One is that those of you who listen to the show know that my wife passed away last December, and today actually would have been her 64th birthday. And Carol and I were here at this park exactly 1 year ago. That's where we celebrated her birthday. So kind of wanted to do that as a, sentimental kind of reason. I also got invited by some friends who are here for something called it's a flint knapping and atlatl convention that they have every year. And flint knapping, if you're not familiar with the term, that's making blades for things like spears and arrows and knives out of rock, out of flint, or similar substances. Sometimes they even make it out of glass. But they do it by hand. They try to follow the techniques of the Neolithic and the Paleolithic people that hunted and gathered, and that's really an intense hobby. And then atlatls, those are basically, people have called them spear chuckers, but that's not an accurate description because they throw darts, and these darts are oversized. They're kind of like arrows, but they're a little thicker, and they're quite flexible, so as you throw them, they kind of flop along. And but they're very effective as hunting tools. This is what humans had just before we figured out bows and arrows. And it's very interesting because it's kind of the last point at which our technology was completely based on us. Because when you throw an atlatl, which I did for the first time just yesterday, it's all human muscle. That's all your power going into that thing, even though it's enhanced by the leverage of the atlatl. But once you switch over to bows and arrows, now the energy flinging an arrow in a bow and arrow actually is inside the technology. The potential energy that shoots the arrow is stored in the bow itself, even though a human put it there. And so now arrows are bow-powered, while atlatls are still human-powered. And I gotta say, I felt a rush flinging this thing, because they used atlatls to hunt mammoths. It's a very effective kind of technology. And of course, I've talked before about Letchworth State Park. This is it's been voted the best state park in the nation, and it's really easy to see why. It's got this beautiful gorge running through the center of it. It's 15 miles long, this park is, and this gorge is about 600 feet deep. It's got these 3 waterfalls, upper, lower, and middle, unimaginatively named waterfalls. But this morning, as I was driving from my campground down here to the Nature Center, which is the only place in this whole region that I could get a Wi-Fi signal, so that they were nice enough to let me plug in here and do the show from here. But as I was driving down just at sunrise, and there was a pull-off for an overlook, so I pulled off there, and I got to see the sun come over the opposite edge of the gorge. I'm on the west side of the gorge, and it came up over the trees on the east side, and the valley below was filled with mist, with fog coming off the river, and so the red of the sunset hit the mist that had come up just above the gorge and turned it red, and it was like looking down into the past. It was like looking down into the earth the way it used to be before we started doing all the mechanical stuff to it, down into this deep valley with trees and a river running through it and bushes, and it was just absolutely gorgeous. Oh, I guess literally gorgeous, since I'm looking into a gorge. And one thing that's kind of struck me about this trip is that I started coming here because I grew up, a good chunk of my youth I grew up in Western New York, and I actually came here as a child, but I remember starting to come here when I was about 16 in high school. And I realized that what's happened here is the trees that were like 40, 50, 60 years old when I started coming here are now, they're well over 100 years old. This place has gotten wilder. The trees have gotten bigger. It all used to be farmland. This land, except for the edges of the gorge itself, had at some point all been cut down, all been plowed, all been turned into, much of what Ohio looks like, which is just, flat farmland. And so what has happened is this land here has recovered. I mean, I saw deer this morning out just before dawn, and I was watching as I was sitting in the parking lot waiting to get into the nature center here. I watched a hawk that was hunting squirrels. I mean, this really has become a very beautiful place, and it's interesting because the animals here have grown adapted to that. The Letchworth State Park itself is kind of a protected reserve kind of area, and they've actually documented that the deer in the entire region, when hunting season starts, they all come into Letchworth State Park because they know their hunters aren't allowed here, and it's just proof that animals are really clever, and they have a culture. They've told each other, somehow they've communicated to each other the idea that you can come here into Letchworth State Park and not get hunted. And so there's just so many stories and so many layers to this park, that one big aspect of it that kind of inspired me when I was younger is that there was a woman named Mary Jemison who in the early colonial days of this region, she, as a young woman or as a child, was kidnapped by the Seneca. And the way the Native Americans often did, once they kidnapped a child, they just integrated them into their tribe. And so she was raised as a Seneca. And she wrote a very famous autobiography, which was sort of a bestseller at the time, describing her life with the Seneca. And when she reached around 16, 17, 18, a bunch of missionaries came, and they offered her the choice. They said, "Oh, we're going to take you back from the Seneca," and she actually chose to stay with them. And she lived the rest of her life as a member of the Seneca Nation, and she did amazing things in that role. She was a very effective advocate for Native rights at the time, and she ended up living here on the property of Letchworth State Park in a cabin, and she was called the Old Woman of the Genesee because the beautiful river that runs through this gorge is the Genesee River. And there's a statue of her here, and they actually saved her cabin. And it's just part of the really wonderful depth in this park. I mean, I've been coming here since I was 16. Now I'm 60. And every time I come, I discover a new little layer. For one thing, I'd never been in this nature center before, and it's amazing. So anyway, that's what I wanted you folks to know. That's what I'm doing, where I am, why I'm not in the studio. But I'm still happy to talk to you. And Josh, I believe we should also at this point be able to talk to our guest, Diane D'Arrigo. All right, Diane, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Hello.
Hello. So Diane, this is actually kind of not too far from your original stomping grounds, right?
Yep.
West Valley.
Western New York, Buffalo, and one of the two things we'll talk about today is just to your west, the West Valley nuclear site, and then far, far to the east is the Zaporizhzhia nuclear reactor, but they both could potentially spread radioactivity to right where you are and to all of us. So that's why you asked me to come on.
Right. Yeah. Both those issues I think are important, and so let's start with Zaporizhzhia, since that's kind of a big thing on. It's so big, even the mainstream media is talking about it. But I think maybe they're not giving the potential danger the right emphasis. Well,
what I see that I find not misleading, but sort of misleading, is that a lot of the reports are that, the radiation levels are normal. And that is the very last, what one needs to know is what the situation is that would lead to increased radiation levels. By the time we've got increased radiation levels, we're in big trouble. So to simply be reporting that radiation levels are normal around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plants it's back-ended reporting.
Right. Once radiation levels are not normal, the disaster has already begun, and
right.
It's too in many ways it'd be too late to prevent a disaster. Well, yeah. Well, let's back up a step though, Diane. I know you've been a frequent guest, but we forgot to mention who you are and who you're with and so forth.
I'm Diane D'Arrigo with Nuclear Information and Resource Service, or NIRS, out of the Washington, D.C. area, just across the street in Maryland. And I've been tracking nuclear power and waste issues for a few decades. And I was around through the Chernobyl disaster, and our website still has on it what happened day by day at Chernobyl. So we tracked that one and are hoping that we're not going to be in a situation. This situation is potentially even more dangerous than Chernobyl. What happened at Chernobyl was one reactor exploded and dispersed its materials, and it was a relatively new one. And it was, some people say, the worst industrial disaster in the world. What we have at Zaporizhzhia are 6 nuclear power reactors, and they've been operating for decades. They were built in the 80s, and I think the last one came online in the 90s. It was interesting when I was looking at their dates that they were in process of being built while Chernobyl was happening. In any case, the way that nuclear reactors operate, as your listeners may know, is that irradiated uranium or fresh uranium fuel goes into the core of a reactor, and over the years that maybe 3 to 4 years that it is used, the uranium atoms are split to release the energy to heat the water, turn the turbines, and make electricity, the fuel itself becomes millions of times more radioactive and very, very hot. So it's radioactive and thermally hot. And that fuel, after its use for maybe 3 or 4 years, is then moved to fuel pools, storage pools that have been filled and filled beyond capacity. And then from there, if the fuel is gotten down enough to be able to go into dry storage, then it would be put into dry canisters. And there are disputes over the integrity of pools. There are disputes over the integrity of dry storage. But for sure, what you've got at a fuel pool, especially at an older reactor like the ones at Zaporizhzhia, are decades of fuel that's millions of times more radioactive than the fuel in the core. So what happened with Chernobyl was there was a core release. The fuel pool did not explode or release. The core released. And that was enough to contaminate vast amounts of land and people, and continues to be closed off today, and people still suffering from it. And it was detected around the entire northern hemisphere a number of times. So what we have at Zaporizhzhia are reactors, 6 reactors. It's the largest, as they repeat over and over, the largest nuclear site in Europe. And it also has fuel pools, which are very full. And so a concern is that if there were a release from either an operating reactor or a fuel pool, that it could contaminate the area and make it impossible to go in to the reactor to manage all of the fuel pools. And there could be a chain reaction. If one went, then the radioactivity levels would get so high that people couldn't take care of the other reactors. So we have a danger of 6 times worse accident, and in this case, it's hard to call it an accident when we have deliberate aggression on the plant, fire starting and shooting and so forth. So the pools require off-site power. The pools require power, and what has made me most fearful is the loss, the deliberate cutting off of power. Now, I think strategically what the Russians are trying to do is cut the power off from the Ukrainian power off from the reactor site and hook it up to Russian power so that they control it. And I'm not really sure. This is just a recent analysis. I'm having a hard time wrapping my mind around the Russians having attacked the Chernobyl site, and now this site. They, of all countries, know the devastating impact that's possible from nuclear reactors going off. So, yes, it's a big concern about nuclear weapons, but nuclear power is a pre-deployed weapon of mass destruction.
Yeah. The Russians know this danger. Well, I should say, at the highest levels, the Russians know this danger, but there have been decades of disinformation, of covering up, of, the average Russian person. Some of them have never even heard of the Chernobyl disaster. And so, I mean, it's a case where very, very few people really understand how hot the fire is that they're playing with over there in Russia.
That's true. What I meant when I was saying that was that whoever's Putin or whoever's running his war, it's hard to understand why attacking and making personnel who are running massive nuclear reactors would want to do that. I can see where they might want to take control of the power grid, and this is a problem. So there are 6 reactors at Zaporizhzhia, and I think that only 1 is still running. But even if they're closed, they are requiring off-site power to keep them cool and to keep the fuel pools cool. And if the off-site power is shut off, Yeah?
To keep the water pumps circulating the water so that it doesn't boil away.
Yes, and there are diesel generators on site, supposedly with maybe up to a week's worth of ability to run. However, there's a report done by Greenpeace by Sean Burney, ShaunBurney, and it's a really good summary of some of the dangers at the Ukrainian. It summarizes the Ukrainian nuclear power situation, and if people wanted to read more about that, we have that linked on our Ukraine resource page at www.nirs.org. We have a page that has a map of Ukraine and the 4 nuclear reactor sites, and the 4 reactor sites where new reactors are being built, and the Chernobyl sites. They've got 9 locations for nuclear power facilities, and you can see that in juxtaposition to the war that's going on and the fronts that specifically at Zaporizhia.
Right.
We really have enough fuel in these pools that it could cause an accident, or it could cause releases that are far beyond what was Chernobyl and Fukushima.
Wow. All right, well, let's pray that doesn't happen, Diane, because I don't think we have too much more. But fuel, the used fuel, the spent fuel, is your area of expertise. And one of the most dangerous fantasies about nuclear waste that is still literally to this day being spread by the pro-nuclear trolls is that we could take this waste, pull it out of a nuke plant, reprocess it, and get new nuclear fuel from it. And so we could run the plants forever on the fuel that has already been mined and stuff. And one place where they tried to do this, which in many ways I think is typical of what happens when countries or companies or entities try to do this theoretical reprocessing, was West Valley, New York. And there's been some very big developments there in the recent weeks. Could you tell us about what's happening at the disastrous site of nuclear waste reprocessing in the U.S.?
The only place in the U.S. where commercial reprocessing took place was at West Valley, New York. That is about 30 miles south of Buffalo. And you were talking about the Seneca Nation in your previous discussion here. The site drains through the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. In the years that the nuclear reprocessing was taking place, well, what it does is it takes irradiated fuel, or spent fuel as you called it, and chop it up, dissolve it in chemicals to extract the uranium and plutonium that's in it to use for either weapons or possibly for making new fuel. And so nuclear reprocessing proponents, they say, oh, yeah, we can recycle it. Well, when you do what this reprocessing step is, it turns out that you end up with many more waste streams. And the water that drains from that site through the Cattaraugus Creek, through the Seneca Nation of Indians territory, was in the years that reprocessing was going on, the most radioactive water in the country. And the Senecas were not warned. So there's the real clear environmental racism component to the nuclear history. The site itself has been projected back in 1996. The estimate was that it would take $10 billion then to clean up the entire site. We're in the process of, quote unquote, having it cleaned up by the Department of Energy. And the huge reprocessing building in which the irradiated fuel was, well, it's the site where the part of the site where the hottest radioactive material, like, I mentioned earlier, millions of times hotter than fresh fuel, it went into building was dissolved, topped and dissolved, and workers there received the highest exposures of the whole nuclear workforce in the nation at the time. And like I said, the water was the hottest. So this building is being demolished. There were about 50 buildings at the site, and most of them have been demolished. But now this one is going to start being demolished supposedly in September. And there are organizations throughout New York. 25 of us sent a letter to Governor Hochul asking her to assure that the building is enclosed or covered during demolition so that the radioactivity doesn't spread throughout Ohio, New York, Canada, wherever the wind blows, Pennsylvania perhaps. We've been... our calls are falling on deaf ears and rejection. So this demolition of one of the most radioactive buildings in the nuclear power and weapons complex is about to be demolished without either covering over it or over the hottest rooms, without having given us a full characterization and inventory of how much radioactivity is there, and without meaningful off-site monitoring. These are the things we've been calling for, and this is another situation, Joe, where I'd say we've got to pray, because we're not getting the technical support, the political support from New York agencies, New York leadership, and it's going to be they're saying it's a 40-month process, so this is going to go on and on. There have been other buildings that have had plutonium in them that were covered during decommissioning. One was in eastern New York, in Niskayuna, New York. There was a smaller reprocessing facility that was enclosed after it had, during the decommissioning, there had been a release, and the EPA required that it be covered. And then in Washington State, they didn't cover, this is at Hanford, there were releases of plutonium that the state detected with its independent monitors. Well, New York State doesn't have independent monitors, so we're never going to know. And it's a permanent pollutant. We're talking about, we have heard in the news recently, very importantly, about PFAS, about chemicals that are permanent chemicals. Well, radioactivity may not be permanent, but when you've got some that are dangerous for 250,000 to 500,000 years, or hundreds of millions of years in the case of iodine-129, they're practically permanent pollutants. And these would be spread into the air, water, soil, environment, food chain. And it's very frustrating that we have this situation at this point. So if people wanted to write a letter to the Buffalo News or to Governor Hochul, I don't know if anybody in Ohio would have influence over New York, but New Yorkers are frustrated. We're glad that there's effort to clean up the site, but it's not being done fully responsibly.
It's not being done properly, right?
There's one other thing I need to say, which is that workers have gone in, and this is to their credit, and tried to clean out the inside of the building to remove as much radioactivity as possible before the demolition. And I have to say that those are the heroes and heroines that all of their work and their risk and their that they've taken, I believe, is going to reduce the amount of threat to the region. But it's still not complete, and we haven't seen, it's not 100% removal of this material, and it doesn't take much plutonium to hurt people.
No, tearing down buildings creates dust, and dust is the most dangerous form of plutonium, because that's how it gets into your lungs, and that's how it can kill people once it's inhaled. Yeah, I'm really disappointed to hear this, especially since I actually worked with Kathy Hochul on a political campaign many, many years ago. A fellow named Tom Fricano was running for Congress, and so Kathy and I actually worked fairly closely together on that campaign, and it's just been interesting to watch her career since then. And I think, I'm going to send some messages. maybe
Great.
they'll get through. Who knows? But
I think you should.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. This is not protecting the people of New York, or as you say, the entire region, by letting this dust get out and not even monitoring properly to see if it is getting out. So, well, thanks so much, Diane.
Their argument is that the monitoring on site will let them know if it's too windy and they should stop their work, but still there's no independent oversight of what they are doing, and the Department of Energy is notorious. I mean, those other two sites that I mentioned where the state in Washington detected and the EPA in Niskayuna, New York required a covering, those were DOE activities. So DOE claims it's learned its lessons, but we'll never know because there's no monitoring to watch for it, and there's no extra protections being taken. So it is a very frustrating thing. And so when people call for more reprocessing, I say no.
No, definitely not. I mean, it's terrible, and it's typical of the attitude of the government towards the wastes that have been created. It's just kind of offhand, just kind of, it'll take care of itself somehow, or will take care of it, but not the kind of careful protection that we need from these terrible radioactive wastes. So thanks so much, Diane, for coming on.
You're welcome.
All right. That was Diane
Enjoy the
D'Arrigo.
rest of your time in Letchworth.
I will. It's amazing. Yeah. So, okay. Brings us now, it's time to hear, after that great report from Diane, it's time to hear from our great advertisers and patrons. Yay. So the For a Green Future is brought to you by the Wood County Park District. The Wood County Park District is a natural resources conservation agency. They protect natural spaces, maintain quality green spaces, provide engaging programming, and they teach people to love and respect nature. They restore wildlife habitats and lead people on outdoor adventures, like the one I'm having. Wood County Parks protects natural spaces in Wood County for all to enjoy, from 8 a.m. to 30 minutes past sunset every day of the year. And there's several ways you can get a hold of them to see what they're doing, what's going on. One is to call at 419-353-1897. That's 419-353-1897. Another is to go to their website, which is wcparks.org. And they are on many different social media, like Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. And for any of those, you just search for WC Parks. And that's also how you find their nifty app. Go to any app store and search for WC Parks, and you can download that. And don't forget, in September is coming up their annual native plant sale, so you want to start saving up your pennies for that. Okay, but you don't need any pennies or anybody of any sort to hear from our next participant here. Rebecca, how are you doing?
Not too badly. How about you?
I'm having a great time here out in the. It's not primitive camping. I literally have access to showers and restaurant food, but it's still camping. We had a campfire, and so it's nice. It's very nice. And so, what will you be?
Sounds nice.
What? Yeah, it is. What will you be talking to us about today, Rebecca?
Okay. Well, this week's segment. I'll be talking to the dog first of all. This week's segment is entitled "Concretions versus Nodules. Know the Difference," because I'm hoping I do know the difference. Although you're gonna have to bear with me. I'm going to have to go slowly and sound out the big words for this one because I had to learn an awful lot to backtrack and learn some basic geology, chemistry, and/or vocabulary here. It was a little bit of an intellectual exercise. First thing in the morning.
Well, let's repeat that first word because I think it went by kind of quick.
Concretions?
Concretions.
Concretions.
All right.
Versus nodules.
Gotcha.
These are both things, I guess, in chemistry and geology. And so I was looking up flint because I thought, well, heck, I don't have any other ideas. I'll just do something that Joe mentioned he's working with flint this weekend, or someone will be. Go, you hush. Flint, let's see. I found a definition. It is a sedimentary cryptocrystalline silica quartz, is what it is. And so cryptocrystalline, I'd heard that one before, is a crystalline, has a crystalline structure.
No, Rebecca, this isn't working. You're going to have to do something with Koga.
Yeah, I'm doing
Or
something.
Okay.
I'm bribing him with a carrot, which also may have a little bit of a crystalline structure going on. Right, there we go, because it was in the back of the fridge. So yeah, it's a sedimentary cryptocrystalline silica quartz. So cryptocrystalline means it has a crystalline structure which is visible only under magnification. So this begs the question, what the heck is a crystalline structure? So that means that it's composed of crystals. It's composed of crystals, obviously. And a crystal, what is a crystal, you ask? Well, I know they're sort of sharp and pointy, but I wanted, to know more than that. So a crystal is a solid material whose constituents, aka atoms, molecules, or ions, are arranged in a highly ordered microscopic structure so as to form something called a crystal lattice, which is a geometric shape with flat faces. Quartz, it turns out, is silicon dioxide, because I found one article that said they were made out of quartz, and Flint is made out of quartz, and another said that it was made out of silicon. Both kind of true, I guess. So, yeah, that's basically what it is. You can just look at it, and that's always stuck with me, because you can just look at it, and it looks kind of flat and gray, and like it used to be mud, which it was. It was mud, basically. According to the UK Geological Society article, it tends to form in chalk. I think it forms in other things too. I get that in other sedimentary rocks. But this was weird because they kept capitalizing chalk, because chalk, if you live in the UK, means the stuff that you write with or whatever. And then it also means it's a village in England, and also it's the name of a stratigraphic deposit, a really large one in northwestern Europe. So I think that's why they were capitalizing chalk. But, so flint tends to form in chalk deposits by replacing the dissolved chalk.
So the white cliffs of Dover are part of that deposit that you're talking about.
Yes, they are.
Okay.
Yep. So, stratigraphy, then I had more questions. Stratigraphy is a branch of geology concerned with the order and position of strata and their relationship to geological time. And so what happens here is that when two bacteria love each other very much, I guess, there's bacterial activity in seabed sediment, which generates hydrogen sulfide, which migrates to the seabed, seawater interface, that makes sense, and dissolves into the carbonate basic chalk, which is combined with, it has to combine with dissolved oxygen which is sinking into the sediments. It's like coming from up to down, I guess, sinking down. And then the carbonate dissolves, the carbonate in the chalk dissolves, and the silica precipitate, flint kind of just trickles in there. It comes from the skeletons of various marine mammals, and it trickles in there, and it forms something which I saw described both as a concretion, but then somebody else said, no, it's not a concretion, it's actually something else. Flint, first of all, it said flint is a concretion, which is a hard, compact mass of matter formed by the precipitation of mineral cement within spaces between particles in sedimentary rock or soil. But actually, when this happens, another article said when this happens to flint, it's not a concretion; it's in fact a nodule, also called a chert nodule or chalcedony, I believe. They look kind of like they're described as fossils or fossilized turtles. To me, I saw some pictures, and they look kind of like cow patties. They look like cow patties made out of stone. And They look like one. That's why people call them concretions. A concretion is actually, consists of the minerals in the rock and around the concretion, plus some of the cementing materials, whereas nodules are a totally different material from the surrounding rock. So that's how you can tell a nodule from a concretion.
Wow, I had no idea, Rebecca.
Me neither. There's a lot of deep, dark mysteries, this whole thing on Earth. So that's, there was all this stuff, you could just go to the chalk cliffs in Europe and dig around a little bit, find a nodule, and make it into something if you were living there during the Neolithic. And that's probably why people started using it. There's just a lot of it around,
Right. The Neolithic and the Paleolithic and the Mesolithic, as I learned yesterday.
Groovy.
In a lecture on, and another thing I learned at that lecture, speaking of chalk, is that the chalk deposits in Denmark have literally the best flint on the earth for making points and things, for making arrowheads and spear
Nice.
heads. So if you're ever in Denmark and are in the mood to do some flint napping, that's the place to go. All right. Well, thanks so much, Rebecca, for that
You're
enlightening report. And now feel free to chime in as we go on to our ecological news segment. Whipsaw kind of ecological news this week. Good news and bad news and stuff in between. But first of all, a little bit of bad news. Boris Johnson has approved the Sizewell C nuclear plant. And that's big news for a lot of reasons. One is that he's doing this literally in the last couple weeks of him being prime minister. He is out. He got ousted. And so he decided to use his last remaining days to make a really horrible decision. And this is an officially horrible decision because this was reviewed by an office of the British government called the English Planning Inspectorate. And the English Planning Inspectorate rejected Sizewell C because they said there's not enough water. The plans say they're going to need this many millions of gallons of cooling water every day, and they don't have it. There's no, it's like physically not going to be possible to cool these plants that they're planning to spend. Right now, the first estimate, which we know from experience, no nuclear plant has ever been built on time or on budget. First estimate is 20 billion pounds. And so Boris Johnson just said, hey, let's go waste 20 billion pounds. And some of the other reasons it was a bad decision is it's going to destroy the most important wetland in Britain right now, called Minsmere. And it's also going to, and part of the ridiculousness of it is it's right on the coast. And more than one projection has said that in 20 years, and this plant isn't going to start producing, their best estimate is 10 years. But of course, we know from experience that 10 years is going to be more like 20. And in 20 years, the site will be underwater. The sea level rise is going to just wipe it out. So
that seems bad.
Yeah, it's something that kind of makes it would weigh on me if I were making this decision. And someone told me, this plant will likely be underwater before it can start. I think I might choose not to do it. And so of course it's the ultra ridiculousness because wind and solar are here right now and producing more than enough power to replace nuclear. And in fact, on the whipsaw effect, a bit of good news. On August 26th, solar power in Britain outproduced nuclear power by a hefty margin. So everybody who's fighting to get this terrible nuclear plant is saying, oh, wind power is not practical. Well, it turns out solar power is more practical than nuclear because solar power is already, as a practical matter, producing more electricity than nukes. So that's the bad news, some bad news. Now, on to the next story. We're moving right along here. Good news, Scotland has thrown the switch on the largest wind farm in Scotland, and it's 1.1 gigawatts of power, which is a little bit bigger than the Davis-Besse nuclear plant, just to give you an idea. And when it's done, it's going to supply power to more than 1.6 million homes. And Scotland is using it looking to mostly export this power to Great Britain. So, it's very nice that the blades. These are some of the biggest turbines that are available. It's an offshore. It's in the North Sea. The name of the development is called the Sea Green development, and the blade tips, when they're up pointed straight up at their highest point, are 613 feet above sea level, which of course is where the level of since it's in the ocean, that's how high they are above the ground or the ocean. There will be 114 turbines when it's all done, and which it is proceeding on time and on budget. And one of the best things about when you're building a wind project, especially a big one like this, is you can turn on each turbine as it's finished. You don't have to wait to complete all 114 turbines and then throw a switch and cross your fingers and hope the whole thing works, as you do with a nuke plant. And in fact, that has happened with they had a nuke plant recently opened up in Ecological, Sweden, and they bragged all about how wonderful it is, but it has been down as much as it's been up because it keeps breaking, and so they keep having to turn off their grand nuke plant, which was over time and over budget by, I think it was triple the original budget. Anyway, wind is exactly the opposite. It works great. It works as predicted. It always comes in on time, often comes in under budget, and that just happened in Scotland on August 23rd. Now, back to the whipsaw effect. South Korea has signed a deal with Russia. It's a $2.5 billion deal. They are going to provide some of the components for the new Egyptian nuclear plant that Russia just signed a deal with Egypt to build a nuclear plant, and North and South Korea is getting in on it. And it really points out that nuclear power is undercutting our foreign policy because Egypt is going to be given billions of dollars to Russia for this nuclear stuff. And now, so what Russia's doing is systematically just going around to all of our most strategic allies in the world and saying, hey, want to get in on some nuclear power? I can supply you. And, they're making deals with our allies and undercutting our influence and sticking themselves in to the base of our domestic policy or our international policy. And we're letting it happen. Biden is letting it happen because it looks like, in some level, he loves nukes, more than he loves having the U.S. be an international power. Willing to sacrifice our international influence in order to promote nuclear energy, which is another sign of just how insane nukes are. I mean, they're too expensive, they're too dirty, they take too long, and they hurt our international security. And yet somehow, because it's nuclear, which Bill Gates loves and which a lot of other billionaires love, they let them do it, which is a huge strategic error. Anyway, there was a former Prime Minister, Moon Jae-in of South Korea. He was actually anti-nuclear, and he was actually elected on a wave of anti-nuclear sentiment following a South Korean movie about nuclear meltdowns. Unfortunately, he got booted by a super conservative Prime Minister, Yoon Suk-yeol, and Yoon has decided he wants to go, not just all in on nukes, he wants to get everybody else in on nukes too. And he's made it a policy decision that they're going to try to export nukes from here on out and basically mess up the world. All right, so let's turn away from our depressing nuclear stuff for a minute and go to some nice green future, truly green future stuff. In the journal Bioscience, 20 ecologists and scientists have they've called for something called the Western Rewilding Network. And essentially what they're saying is that we have to restore beavers and wolves to the west. And if we restore beavers and wolves, it's going to create all kinds of wonderful benefits. It's going to control the elk population, and the elks tend to overgraze when they don't have wolves eating them. It's going to support tree growth. It'll boost biodiversity. It'll improve water quality, increase carbon sequestration, and it'll store riparian, that is river stream habitats. And Joanna Lambert of the University of Colorado is one of the people in this study. And Colorado actually has already sort of started on this process because, as we've reported back in 2020, they passed a referendum, the whole state did, to restore wolves to Colorado. And so, it's just nice to see that some people, even though we're being inundated with all this disinformation about how wonderful things like clear cutting and nuclear power and natural gas power are, there's still some people, a lot of people, that have their focus on creating the green future that is a livable and a nice future. And another thought that struck me here at Letchworth State Park, I think I said this at the beginning, but it bears repeating. Anywhere on the planet can be as beautiful as Letchworth. I mean, all we have to do is not destroy it for 100 years, and it will revert back to a beautiful, natural situation. And that's something that inspires me every day, because the knowledge that we see it over and over again is once we stop destroying it, nature comes back. And Letchworth is just a particularly beautiful example of that. But the same could be true of Northwest Ohio. If we brought those marshes back that we've spent so many billions of dollars and so many decades trying to eradicate, if we let the marshes come back, we'll get the cattail marshes, we'll get the animals and plants that live there. We'll have lots more clean water available going into Lake Erie. We won't have the algal blooms that, all we have to do is not destroy it, people. That's the great thing about nature, is that it takes care of itself as long as you're not actively destroying it. So we have to stop actively destroying it. All right, so just a couple minutes left, and one thing I wanted to just sort of mention, been in the news, and that is that they are distributing rabies vaccines all over the East Coast, all the way from Maine down to Virginia. They're spending $500 million tossing out these fish-flavored baits to try to prevent rabies in critters. And they say it's not dangerous. If you see one of these planes or helicopters dropping baits, don't touch them, though. They say to wash. And it's just a case where it's part of the APHIS program, which we've talked about the APHIS program before. One of the main purposes of the APHIS program is to kill animals. So these same animals that the scientists just told us we need to reestablish, one of APHIS's main jobs is killing those animals all over the West. And they kill literally millions of them every year. And so
okay, and why is it named after a sacred Egyptian bull?
I'm not sure. I you know what, the acronym, it's an acronym, and I can't, off the top of my head, it's like Animal Prevention of Harm something. I don't
think APHIS would approve.
No, it does sound like someone was like tweaking an Egyptian god there, doesn't it? So, which is never a good idea. But,
I know, yeah.
Oh, you know?
Well, it just instinctively seems like, don't do it unless you really have to, just in case.
Right. So
don't they have cursed mummies or something? Won't they get angry and come after you? I don't know.
Yeah.
Ask archaeologists. Egyptian stuff's dangerous to mess with. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Talk about things that actually matter and are relevant.
No, that's good though. They shouldn't be. I mean, it's part of it. It's this weird dichotomy, like we talked about last week with the cutting down of the sequoias that have been burned. The idea that you're going to save it. On one hand, you're trying to save it, and on the other hand, you're literally actively trying to destroy it. It doesn't work long term. Long term, we got to let nature recover. That's the big thing.
Yeah.
And once we do that, we'll have a green future. So that's it for this week. Thanks so much for listening. This is Joe DeMare.
And Rebecca Wood.
And we are signing off.
The
The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that black demon oil's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. I don't want them nukes run by them kooks who think radioactivity is fun. No more three-headed frogs or kids with leukemia. Nuclear power ain't fit for a dog. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that nuclear power's got us hustling